Hey guys, it's Bella. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to another Mystery Monday. If you're new here, welcome. We talk about true crime cases here on this channel on Mondays. So if that is something that you're interested in, then please come and join us. Subscribe, make sure you don't miss any future videos. I actually have 2 videos for you this week. So we're doing a Monday and then we're doing a not Monday, Mystery Monday. Also, you may have noticed I have a new microphone. I feel very, very professional. So hopefully it sounds crisp, you know, or maybe hopefully it doesn't, because the sound of my own voice it's not my favorite thing. But here we are, bringing it to you in HD. Before we do get into today's case, I just quickly want to thank our sponsor, NordVPN. You guys know I love my Nord. I couldn't live without it, really. I have it on almost all of the time because the internet is a scary place and I don't trust it. I don't trust public Wi-Fi. I don't trust any sort of link. I don't trust any of it, really. And it's my job to be on the internet. So I'm on here all the time, and let's be real, even if it wasn't my job to be on the internet all the time, I would be. I mean, like, aren't most of us? And so honestly, it's really, everything that Nord does is really important, because while you are on the internet, they are there protecting you behind the scenes from hackers, scammers, spammers, fake websites, password attacks, fake public Wi-Fis or compromised public Wi-Fis. None of it's good, which is why Nord is great. But on top of that, I also use it just, you know, for my own purposes, just because, you know, I just got back from LA and I'm living in London at the moment. So when I was in LA, I used my VPN to change my laptop's location to put me back in the UK so I could watch all of my shows that I am currently watching, because like America, they have all of their own subscription services that I do not have because I do not live there. So I need to keep watching them on my own subscription services. And either way, I wouldn't want to lose my progress or where I'm up to. So whenever I travel, I have to use my VPN to put me right back here so I can keep on watching everything. I'm also watching the Australian Love Island for the first time ever. I've never watched a season of it before, but I've been seeing clips of this season and it looked really good, and it is. You know, I've been watching it. I've been watching the entire raw eggs, including their shell, being eaten whole, which is insane, but it's good. It's good this season. And so I'm using my VPN to put me in Australia to watch that so I can watch it in real time and I don't get any spoilers, because the internet is spoilers are abundant. Honestly, if there is one thing I can recommend to you guys, it is to get NordVPN, because I feel like it's one of those things that you can kind of procrastinate and put off. It's one of those small tasks that seems, I guess, monumental at the time, but once you get it, it is the best thing ever. It took me years to finally get a VPN, and now I really couldn't live without it. I couldn't even imagine not having a VPN. So if you guys are interested, make sure you head to nordvpn.com/bellafiore. You can get a huge discount on a 2-year plan plus an extra 4 months free, and it's all risk-free as well because they have a 30-day money-back guarantee. So make sure you guys check that out. I'll leave all of the information in my description, the link in the description as well. And let's go ahead and get into today's case. So today we're going to be talking about an Australian case. We're going to be talking about the victims of a serial killer who reigned terror in Melbourne for decades. And this case is really frustrating, as most cases are really frustrating, but this case, it's just like long before this guy's first known murder, it was very clear that there was just no chance that he could ever be reformed or rehabilitated. So he should have been in prison long before his first known murder was committed. He had a very long, horrifying criminal history, which somehow he just kept getting to go out and get out of prison and live his life, and, was then able to go out and murder multiple women. So on the 4th of October in 1997, Elaine and her husband Ronald McDonald, yeah, you heard that right, his name is Ronald McDonald, they, along with Muriel's sister Elaine, went out to a place called Clifford's Road in Somerton, which is about 13 miles or 20 kilometers north of Melbourne CBD. And Clifford's Road is a place where people would go to just, I guess, illegally dump rubbish that they couldn't be bothered disposing of legally, or it was just stuff that's kind of hard to dump legally, so they would just go and chuck it there. So once a week, Ronald and Muriel would go to Clifford's Road and they would look for aluminium cans. They would look for just, little things that caught their eye that they could maybe take and sell on for a bit of extra cash. As they're looking through all of the rubbish there, they're only about 1.5 meters from the road when Ronald moves a piece of cardboard, and underneath is a human body, which at first Elaine and Muriel thought was just a mannequin, right? They thought it had just a store had come and dumped it, and that was that. But Ronald noticed that on the hand there were rings, and on the wrist there was bracelets, there was a tattoo on the leg, a graze on the lower back, and he was like, no guys, this is a human body. They all went back to Ronald's car to contact the police. He had a phone fitted in the car because this was a time, before mobile phones. So they contacted the police. The police arrived within about 10 minutes and immediately went over to inspect the body. They found that her pants and her underwear had been pulled down, and her top and her bra had been pulled up, exposing her breasts, which had been mutilated. Her left breast had been sliced off and placed inside her mouth with the nipple facing outwards. A receipt from a Bilo supermarket was also found stuck to her left cheek, and they also found a black woolen glove nearby, which they took in for forensic testing. The postmortem exam revealed that her breast had been removed after her death. They found injuries all over her body, bruising and stab wounds. There was blunt force trauma to the head, as well as a deep injury to her left wrist. There was evidence of compression around her neck, but due to drugs found in her system and underlying health issues, an exact cause of death couldn't be determined. They did find, however, that she was murdered in the early hours of the 4th of October in an undetermined location, after which time her body was then moved to and dumped in Clifford's Road. The woman was positively identified as that of 40-year-old Margaret Mah. She was born on the 14th of June in 1957. By 1997, aged 40, she lived by herself in a flat on the Hume Highway in Craigieburn, which is a suburb on the fringe of Melbourne. She initially had been working at a bank and had a very normal life, but after being introduced to heroin, she said that her life became, quote, a roller coaster ride. She began working in the sex industry and would work along the highway in which she lived, so she was quite well known around the area just by locals who saw her working or hitchhiking, because she hitchhiked a lot as a means of getting around. And she was also well known by the locals and shopkeepers in the area because she would just go into a lot of shop for, hours on end just browsing, so she was pretty well known in the area. She was also a known drug addict, which caused a lot of tension in her relationship with her daughter Natasha. Natasha was in school at the time, and she would, often come and stay with her mum sort of on and off in an effort to mend their strained relationship. Natasha said that the last time she saw her mum was at about 7 p.m. on the 3rd of October. She was leaving the house to go out and meet some friends, and, her mum was home, so she took the keys with her so that she could get back in later on. At around 7:15 p.m, Margaret also left the house to go to a nearby news agency, and after which she headed home, but she obviously couldn't get in because Natasha had the keys. So Margaret went to a neighbor's house, asked if they could help her, break into her house and get her inside, but they couldn't, and so she decided to go out. At 7:45 p.m, a witness saw her hitchhiking on the Hume Highway. They saw her get into a late blue or green model Ford Falcon heading towards the city. At 8:05 p.m, she went into a pharmacy on Gaffney Road to pick up her methadone, which was part of her treatment for drug addiction. And she told the pharmacist there that she had been given a lift by a man who lived at her old address in Craigieburn. After this time, she was then seen at the Broadmeadow Shopping Centre, and she was there for a few hours just browsing, which, like I said, is something she did often. The shopkeepers knew her. One shopkeeper said, quote, she would often come and shop for hours on end. She would never really bother anyone. So all of these sightings are verified, right? They're people who, they're locals, they're shopkeepers, they know who Margaret is. And the last time that she was ever seen alive was at 12:15 a.m. A witness saw her leaving the shopping centre and walking in the direction of Pascoe Vale Road. She had shopping bags with her, which were filled with, a mix of items, but the shopping bags and these items were never found, and this was the last time that Margaret Mah was ever seen alive.
The 40-year-old was under a cardboard sheet, her clothing partially removed. The body had been mutilated, the left breast had been completely severed.
A special task force named the Mikado Task Force, consisting of 7 officers, was formed to look into Margaret's murder as well as a few other cases that had happened around the same time and area. The task force spent 11 months trying to solve the case before it was shut down, and Margaret's case went cold. On the 1st of November 1997, less than a 15-minute drive from where Margaret's body was found on Clifford's Road, another body was discovered, this time in Faulkner Cemetery. The body was that of 25-year-old Messina Helvargas. Messina was born on the 17th of February 1972 to parents George and Christina. She had 2 brothers and a sister, and they were a very close, very tight-knit family. Messina was described as a smart, soft, and kind-hearted woman. She attended La Trobe University, where she studied accounting, and in 1992, at a university ball, she met a man named Angelo Gorgievsky. They hit it off right away. They dated for the next 5 5 years before becoming engaged in 1997. By that same year, Messina was now working as an accountant for ANZ, which is a bank in Australia and New Zealand, and she and Angelo had just purchased a block of land in Mill Park. So everything was just going really well for them. You know, they were this young, happy couple in love, and they had dreams of building their dream house on this block of land, living a long, healthy life together, having a beautiful family together. On the 31st of October, Messina stayed at Angelo's parents' house, and she stayed there until about 3 p.m, at which time she left. She took Angelo's car, which was a red Ford Telstar, and she drove it to Faulkner Cemetery to go and visit her grandmother's grave. This is something that she did every fortnight. She came from a very close-knit Greek Orthodox family, so she would go there and she would bring flowers and she would pray over her grandmother's grave. At 6:45 p.m, her fiancé Angelo got home and Messina still wasn't there, and as hours and hours went by, he began to get really worried because he knew that her only plans that day had been to go to the cemetery, and then she was meant to come home, they were meant to have dinner together. And so he and his dad at 4 a.m. went out to the cemetery, and when they found his car, the red Ford Telstar that she had taken, in the car park there, they immediately contacted the police. The police arrived at the cemetery, and at 4:35 a.m, they escorted him into the cemetery to look for her because, of course, it was locked by this time. So they escorted him in there, and that is when they found the body of 25-year-old Messina Helvargas. She was found on an empty plot near her grandmother's grave, slumped between two headstones. Her murder had been an extremely violent and bloody one, and she had been attacked from behind as she placed flowers on her grandmother's grave. The flowers were scattered around everywhere during the attack, and blood stained the gravestones, the floor around her, the headstones nearby, and all of the clothes that she had been wearing. She suffered catastrophic injuries, including 85 stab wounds all over her body, her arms, her knees, her thighs, but they were mostly concentrated around her breasts. It was clear that she gave her everything into trying to fight her attacker off, which could be seen by, an overturned pot plant nearby, the deep gashes on her hands and her fingers, which indicated that she had even tried to grab the attacker's knife. Her glasses and her shoes both came off during the altercation, and she had kind of long fingernails, which underneath had gravel and a tuft of hair. Her bloodstained shirt had been partially pulled up, exposing her bra. Cigarettes and a glass jar with a cork stopper inside were found nearby, and they were taken for forensic testing. There was a set of tire marks found in the car park which were photographed, but none of these potential points of evidence were able to provide any leads as to who the killer may be, and there was no forensic evidence whatsoever left behind by the killer. Messina also had no known enemies. She had given no indication in the lead up to her death that, she felt threatened or scared, or that there was anything troubling her in the lead up to her death. It seemed to just be a completely random attack, and it became headline news in Melbourne almost immediately. The Herald Sun released a newspaper which was headlined "Slain at Grand's Grave," and then underneath that was a subheading which said "Police fear random attack." She was determined to have been murdered at around 4:30 p.m. and this was on a Saturday. This was broad daylight on a Saturday at a busy cemetery. So police believed there had to have been some sort of witness, somebody who saw her, somebody who heard something, somebody who saw her attacker at some point. And so they did a press conference with her family to appeal to the public for any information, for any witnesses to come forward. Her father, George, said during this press conference, quote, "Every day is nothing but misery in our house. There has to be someone who knows something or suspects something. It's not going to make me feel better, but at least we would know who did it." And sure enough, there were, many witnesses who came forward after this public appeal who had been at the cemetery that day. The last person to see Messina alive was a woman named Elva Hayden. She worked at the tea rooms within the cemetery, and at 3:47 p.m, she sold Messina the flowers that she had taken to her grandmother's grave. There were many witnesses who came forward to report that they had heard screams at the cemetery at around the time of Messina's murder, so around, 4:30 p.m. The screams were described as initially being piercing screams, multiple piercing screams, which became more and more subdued. Eventually, they turned into moaning before turning to silence. None of these witnesses actually saw anything, they just heard the screams, but more witnesses came forward. I think about 9 witnesses ended up coming forward to report that they had seen a suspicious man at the cemetery on the day of the murder and then also in the lead up to the murder. So this guy had obviously been scoping the cemetery out, looking for a victim in the lead up to the murder. Stephanie Porlock was one of these witnesses, and she said that she had been at the cemetery sometime before the murder, just tending to her mother's grave, when she saw this man there who was just walking in like a really odd way. He was walking very quickly, very intentionally, and he was looking all around him, but he wasn't looking at the graves. And then all of a sudden, he just starts walking really quickly directly towards her, and it freaked her out so much that she immediately just got up and went straight to her car, and he actually followed her to her car, but thankfully she had locked all of the doors before he got there. She said, quote, "He stood very close to my car and just looked at me. I was very frightened. I saw that he was wearing either glasses or sunglasses, but I'm not sure which. He had blonde hair and looked as though he was between 30 and 40 years old." Another woman named Janet Morton came forward and said that she was at the cemetery in either July or August of 1997, and she was there researching a family tree. She was in the rose garden, reading some of the names on the plaques when she sees this man there. And, she looks at him, he's looking at her, and so she kind of smiles to be polite. And this guy just completely ignores that she had smiled at him and just kept staring at her. She said, quote, "I recall that this made me feel foolish because he didn't respond to my smile. He was a soft sort of looking fella and was a bit pudgy. He was just an ordinary looking man." She also said that he would have been, just over 5'6". Now, because she's there researching family tree, she's looking all over at different plaques. And so she moves about 50 feet away from where she had this interaction with this guy. And she notices that he kind of follows her to this new spot. And she doesn't think much of it at the time, but then she moves a third time and he follows her again, and he appears to be watching her. And so she just got really freaked out by the whole situation and moved to a completely different area of the cemetery. She said, quote, "I was there for maybe 20 minutes when I suddenly heard something and looked over towards my left. Straight away, I saw the same man coming straight at me with a look in his eyes that really frightened me. He was so close and coming so fast at me that I put my left hand up and began walking backwards. I'm not sure, but I think that I may have either screamed or yelled something at him." At this point, after she, screams or yells at him, he starts to walk away, but he just goes behind this tree or these bushes, and she can see his feet there, and she's like, nothing good is gonna come from this. This guy is just being a creep. So she just turns and bolts. She runs out of the cemetery, so much so that she even jumped over a gravestone at one point, and she runs out onto the road, at which point she sees her husband's car because her husband had driven her there. And so she sees his car, she jumps in the car, and she tells him everything that just happened. So he goes into the cemetery to look for this guy, maybe have some words with him, whatever. But the man is just gone. He's nowhere to be found. It was actually a really, really traumatic experience for her as well. And she said, quote, "This man frightened me so much that it took me about 6 years to return to that spot to continue my research." Saval Latif is a young school teacher who was there visiting the cemetery on the 5th of October, so less than a month before Messina's murder, and she had a very, very similar terrifying experience. She was still at her car. She'd opened the boot to get the flowers out of her boot, and she said, quote, "I looked up and saw a man approaching me. At this stage, he was only about 4 meters away from me. He did not look to be normal. He looked very focused, striding purposely towards me. When I looked up, I appeared to startle him." She ended up getting back into her car and driving to another area of the cemetery and parking there to get away from this guy. But then as she was sitting at her father's grave, she saw this same man striding purposefully towards her. And she said, quote, "I have absolutely no doubt that the person who came at me was going to hurt me. And I believe the only reason he didn't was that I stood up and my height threw him." She ended up seeing this man in another area of the cemetery, and again, he was just purposefully coming straight towards her, but thankfully she had been meeting her sister, and her sister showed up right at this time. The man saw the sister and then just pretended to keep walking past her, as if he hadn't just come at her 3 separate times now. She described the man as a white man between 45 and 50 years old. She said he was about 5'8", stocky, and had a bulging stomach. She said that he had short grey hair with a receding hairline, and said while he didn't say anything to her, the look in his eyes was terrifying. So like I said, there was about 9 women all in all with similar accounts of, they've had a similar experience to the 3 I've just described. They all described a similar looking man, but there was one witness in particular who had described this same man and said that he had approached her on the morning of the 1st of November 1997, so just hours before Messina's murder. Her name was Lema Berman. She was doing maintenance around the cemetery when this man approached her, and she said the whole conversation was really, really odd because he told her he was looking for his adoptive mother's grave, but that he had never seen his adoptive mother before. He didn't know what she looked like, which, for a lot of reasons just doesn't make sense. He told her that he was building a family tree. They got to talking. He ended up showing her the gravesite, I guess, of the grave that he was looking at, and she offered him a rake to tidy it up, which he accepted. He told her his name was John Roberts and then gave her an incomplete phone number. And then later on, when she went past this gravesite again, she noticed that it hadn't been cleaned up at all. Like, he took the rake, wanted to tidy up the gravesite, but then I guess didn't at all. She also said that he smelt of alcohol, which a lot of the other descriptions said the same thing. Or a lot of them also said that he was wearing like these gold rimmed glasses, kind of like, I guess, the Jeffrey Dahmer sort of glasses. She described him as being in his late 30s, said that he had light brown hair, that he was probably around 5'7" and had a medium build. She was able to help police come up with a computerized drawing of the man, which was released to the public. $1 million reward was offered. 1,500 people were questioned. Police were working around the clock on this case. They ended up narrowing down a list of 100 suspects, which they eliminated one by one until there was just one suspect that they couldn't rule out, but they were never able to lay any charges against this guy. And there were, years went by and there were no significant breakthroughs in the case. Messina's father, George, never gave up in trying to bring his daughter's killer to justice and find out what happened. He put pressure on the police, on the MPs. He was always trying to keep this case in the public eye and keep people thinking about it, keep people talking about it. He said, quote, "I don't want anyone else to go through what we're going through." On the 19th of April 1999, Rena Hoffman and her friend 28-year-old Nicole Patterson had plans for dinner. Rena was running late, so she'd left Nicole a message on her phone to let her know that she wasn't going to be there on time, but she still hadn't heard back from her by the time she arrived at Nicole's Northcote home just before 7 p.m. The veranda lights were on at Nicole's house, so Rena goes up, she rings the doorbell, and Nicole's dog started barking, but Nicole didn't answer the door, despite Rena ringing the doorbell multiple times. Eventually, she forced her way into her friend's apartment, and like I said, the lights were on, there was music playing, but there was no sign of Nicole. She called out for her, but Nicole didn't call back. So Rena made her way through the house. She went into Nicole's home office, which is where she found her friend's body lying on the floor in a crucifix position. She was covered in blood. The floor around her was covered in blood. She was found naked from the waist down with her underwear still around one of her ankles. A dark piece of cloth had been neatly folded and placed beneath her heels, slightly raising them off the floor. The only items of clothing that she was found wearing was a bra, which was pulled up above her breast, and it was kind of loose, it wasn't on properly. And then she also had this yellowy orange type of singlet which was covering her breasts. Immediately, Rena runs into the living room to grab Nicole's phone to call 000, and the operator asked her to go and check if Nicole was still breathing. So she went back to Nicole's body. She couldn't find a pulse, and so she went to touch Nicole's chest to see if it was still, rising and falling with her breathing. And as she did so, when she touched Nicole's chest, she found that it was cold to the touch and that she wasn't still breathing. She also found that that orangey yellow singlet that she had been wearing was actually her breast tissue. So she wasn't wearing a top at all. It was the fatty tissue where her breasts should have been, but they had been cut off her chest. Police arrived at the scene just before 7 p.m. and Detective Senior Sergeant Jeff Meyer, who was head of the homicide squad on the case, said, quote, "It was a very confronting scene, even for someone who has dealt with death and murder many times. There were no signs of forced entry into the house. All of the doors and the windows were locked. Bloodstains were found on the exterior of the front door, in the hallway on an interior door jamb, which indicated that the killer had gone through the house after the murder, and it also appeared that they had tried to clean up after themselves. There were certain surfaces that they had wiped down, trying to clean up any evidence that they may have left behind. Nicole's dog Bella was secured in the backyard, so it was assumed the killer was, entered from the front door, that she knew he was coming, that the killer was known to Nicole, and she had gone and secured her dog to allow him to come in through the front door without Bella going up to them and, doing what dogs do when a person enters their home. In Nicole's office, they also found 2 coffee mugs along with a tray that had a pot of sugar, a jug of milk, and a tipped over coffee pot on it, which just further indicated that the killer was known to Nicole. They had gone into her home office to have a cup of coffee before he then proceeded to attack her and kill her. She also worked from home as a psychotherapist, so it was safe to assume that this was potentially one of her clients, considering they were found, like I said, in her home office. One of the most important things that they found at the scene was, again, it was in her home office. It was her diary, and there was an entry from 9 a.m. on the day of her murder, which read Malcolm and then a phone number next to it. Now, of course, the investigation into Nicole's murder got underway immediately, and police went out into the street to question her neighbors to see if anyone had seen or heard anything, and all of her neighbors were completely shocked that not only something like this could happen in their street, but that it would happen to Nicole, because they all knew Nicole as this young, happy, kind woman. Nobody had actually seen anything, but 2 of the neighbors did hear screams coming from Nicole's house. One witness said that they were walking past Nicole's house at around 9 a.m. that day when they heard a female voice yell, "You f***ing cunt," twice. They said it didn't sound like she was angry. It sounded like she was maybe upset at the person she was yelling at. He couldn't say for sure if it was Nicole, but he assumed it was because it was coming from her house. He also said that he didn't look up, he didn't look into her house because he just assumed, that it was a domestic argument and he didn't want to be a sticky beak. The other witness, which was also a neighbor who lived on the street, said that at around 9:30 a.m. that morning, he went out onto his, terrace veranda area for a cigarette, which is when he heard a female scream coming from the direction of Nicole's house. It sounded like this person was hurt or in pain, and so he decided to stay out on the veranda for a couple of more minutes, which is when he saw a man walking with what he described as a sort of intentness, but he didn't recognize this man as anybody who lived on the street. Police went on to question friends, family, colleagues, anybody that may have known Nicole to learn more about her, to understand what may have led to this. Nicole Patterson was born in Melbourne on the 28th of May, 1970. She was born to parents Pam and William and had 2 older siblings, Kylie and Andrew. Her mum, Pam, said Nicole was, quote, a brilliant baby, the best any other mother could have. She also said, quote, she was always smiling or laughing.
Nikki was just a lovely, fun-loving, very intelligent child. She was very passionate and compassionate.
She was an extremely smart and talented girl in all aspects. Her mother said, quote, everything she did well, whether it was academic or sport. She was emotionally stable and never exhibited any anger. She was quite the opposite, actually. She could see goodness in everybody and wanted to help everyone in need and solve the problems of the world. In grade 3, she won a full scholarship for her schooling at Methodist Ladies College. She excelled at swimming, dance, music. At one point, her parents even thought she would become a musician because she was so talented at playing the flute. Obviously, she was still a teenager, right? So she was described by her mum as a bit of a scallywag. She was lively, she was mischievous, she loved playing pranks on people. Once she finished high school, she went on to attend Rusden College, where she completed a Bachelor of Education in Psychotherapy courses. And she went on to pursue a career in psychotherapy because she was always very passionate about wanting to help people. Nicole's friend, Rena Hoffman, the one that actually discovered her body, they had met in psychotherapy courses, and Rena described Nicole as, quote, an extremely integral friend, very supportive and trustworthy. She was sensitive and a very intelligent and creative person. She said that after they graduated, Nicole started something which she called the Dream Analysis Group, and this consisted of 4 women who had all done the psychotherapy courses together, and they would get together every fortnight, talk about their dreams, and they would laugh and they would cry together. By 1996, Nicole was living a happy and healthy life and looking forward to the future. Her sister Kylie had 2 daughters by this time, and Nicole just absolutely adored them. It was obvious to everybody that she would be a great mother someday. It was during this same year that she rented the house on Harper Street in Northcote, which is where she was later murdered. She would garden there. She was growing vegetables there. She turned the front bedroom of the house into her office to see her psychotherapy clients. And she also worked as a youth worker and met her boyfriend Richard doing this. He was a drug and alcohol counselor. Nicole's home business, it was kind of slow to get off the ground because, when you're working as a therapist at home, you need to build a client base, and most of her early clients were referred to by her boyfriend. So she started advertising in the newspaper, which is when she got her first client. She had a guy named Malcolm who contacted her who wanted, help working through his gambling addiction, and she was so excited about it. She was so excited that her hard work had paid off, that her advertisement had paid off, and she had got her very first client. She told all her friends and family. She wrote it in her diary, of course, which was found at the scene of the crime. And this was one of the biggest leads that police had in this case, because this meeting that she had with Malcolm was set for the exact date and time of her murder. So of course the police tracked this Malcolm guy down. His phone number is right next to his name, and they tracked this phone number down to a 24-year-old international student named Harbhajan Singh Kohli, and he went by Harry. He had moved to Australia from India in March of 1999 to do his business administration course, and he purchased that phone number shortly after arriving in Australia, so just over a month before Nicole's murder. According to Harry as well, he was the only person who ever used his phone. He never lent it out to anyone or anything. Because the number was such an integral part of this investigation, police decided to place Harry under surveillance, and it became clear very, very quickly that he just lived a normal life. There was no way that he was involved in this murder at all, but police decided to question him again to figure out how the killer got his number and used his number. What police found was that he had called up to 60 different numbers, which he had found on the university notice board applying for different jobs. One of these jobs that he had applied for and called up for was kind of a general labor job, just like cleaning, gardening, that sort of thing. And the name that was given as a reference for this job was Peter. Harry called Peter on the 9th of April, and Peter told him, the work is not going to start until the 12th of May, so give me your number and I'll give you a call closer to that date. Police then went and looked at the call log from Nicole's landline, all of the incoming and outgoing calls, and they found there was one number in particular that made a lot of calls to her landline phone, and this number belonged to a man named Peter Dupas. And Peter Dupas actually happened to be the one suspect that they had not been able to rule out in the murder of Messina Halvargas. And the more and more they looked into this guy, the more and more they realized that this was their man. So let me tell you a little bit about Peter Dupas and why they believed it was him, because the more they looked into him, his history, and in particular his criminal history, that is why it became so evident that this had to have been their guy. For a guy with this sort of history to be not ruled out of Messina Halvargas' case, and now he's been calling Nicole's landline, and he has a connection to the number that was found in her diary. So Peter Dupas was born in Sydney on the 6th of July 1953 to parents George and Mel Dupas. His father George worked as a taxi driver, and his mother she ran some Tupperware parties. Peter was the youngest of their 3 children, and so he was treated like an only child because his brother Robert and his sister Faye were much older than him. When he was a toddler, the family moved to Melbourne, and then when he was 12, his older siblings had moved out of home. He lived a very normal life at home. His parents showered him in affection. They were very loving, but school was a very different story for him. He was not very bright. He had to repeat his first year of school. He was kind of short, and I read a book about this case, and they said he was short and built like a dumpling. So he was bullied pretty heavily at school. They even nicknamed him Pugsley after Pugsley from the Addams Family. He also had the appearance of female breasts, which were, I guess, a big insecurity of his, and I mention it because it may have been what led to him mutilating and removing the breasts of his victims. During school, he really didn't have any friends. He didn't talk to any other students inside or outside of school, except for when he was in fights with them. He would get into these little scraps with kids that would bully him, and it wasn't long before his violence started to escalate to more than just, fights in the schoolyard. In 1968, when he was 15 years old, he was living with his family in Mount Waverley, and they lived next door to a young couple. On the 3rd of October, he went round to this next door neighbor's house, and the 27-year-old mother was home with her 5-week-old baby. He asked her if he could borrow a knife so that he could go and help his mum peel some vegetables. And of course, he's like this 15-year-old kid still in his school uniform. She doesn't think a thing about it. She goes to the kitchen, she grabs him the knife, and within seconds of her handing him this knife, he just comes at her and starts stabbing and slashing at her. He gets her down onto the ground and starts straddling her while just, crazily stabbing at her. This woman said, quote, "He had the handle in his hand and the blade was pointing at me. He then lunged forward at me and made a stabbing movement at my stomach with the knife. He did not say anything, and I was saying, 'Peter, what's wrong?' We struggled violently then for a long time. Almost straight away, he knocked me down on the floor and fell on top of me. I was trying to talk to him, trying to find out what was wrong. When he couldn't get a good lunge at me with the knife, he grabbed my hair and I started to become exhausted and I started to panic. I then started to scream as loud as I could, and as I was screaming, he placed his hand into my mouth and tried to force his hand down my throat. He kept covering my nose and my mouth with the palm of his hand." She sustained cuts all over her neck and her face, and then particularly her hands because she had been struggling with him, trying to get the knife off him. And then during the struggle, all of a sudden, he just stops. He just turns the knife towards himself. He gets up off of her, and then he lets her take the knife off of him. And he just becomes hysterical and he starts sobbing and crying. Later, when he was taken in by police and questioned by police, he said that he doesn't know why he did it. He couldn't even remember holding the knife in his hand. As a result of the attack, he received 18 months probation, and then he was also sent to the Larundel Psychiatric Hospital for evaluation. And at Larundel, they just described him there as being the perfect kid. He was so friendly, so caring, so helpful, so kind, so funny, just like the perfect kid. And so he was released after 2 weeks with a note from a psychiatrist that his mother had basically just like overprotected him his whole life. And even with this incident, his mother, when she was telling friends about it or saying what had happened, she was like, it was just a brainstorm. The woman that he attacked felt so unsafe that he had been released that the whole family ended up moving within weeks. And then he just, went back to school like normal. His 2-week absence wasn't explained to any of the kids then. Not that any of them really cared that he was gone in the first place. He didn't really have any friends at school. After finishing year 11, he left school and he started working as an apprentice fitter and turner at the local factory. And the people that worked with him said, the impression they got of him was that he was a good young kid. He was helpful. The women there used to mother him a bit, said he had a baby face. He was short, he was happy enough. And he also got a girlfriend during this time named Heather, who worked as a nurse. And during the work Christmas party, he brought Heather. She had a black eye. And so the next time one of his co-workers saw him at work, he brought it up with him and said, it's not okay to hit your girlfriend. And in response, Peter just like punched this guy in the stomach. Peter and Heather actually ended up getting engaged, and then Heather broke off the engagement, broke up with Peter, and handed the ring back. We don't actually know why she ended things, but I think it's safe to assume there was a number of reasons because there was a number of things wrong with this guy. I mean, he just really he just wasn't wired right in his brain. There was just something wrong with him. When he was 18 years old in 1972, at around midnight, he went and started peeping through the bathroom window of this woman that was showering, and her husband actually saw him and chased him down the street. When he was confronted by the police about this, he just said, I was taking a shortcut to my car, and he was given a $50 fine. Around a year and a half later, on the 5th of November in 1973, he parked up out front of a house in Mitcham and, gets out of the car, lifts the bonnet, goes and knocks on the front door. Inside the house is a 23-year-old mother, and she's home alone with her 18-month-old baby. And he kind of points to his car. He says, my car's broken down. Do you have a screwdriver that I could use and I can get it all fixed up and be on my way? So of course she goes inside to get him a screwdriver, and as she turns around, he enters the house, pulls out a knife, grabs her by the throat, and threatens to harm her baby if she doesn't do what he says. He proceeded to tie up her legs and her feet, took her to the bedroom where he raped her, and he then attempted to do the same thing to 2 other women. He would pull up at their house, open his bonnet, ask for some help. But at these other two houses, the first house, he just managed to steal some money. And then at the second house, the woman said that her husband was going to be home any minute, and so he just left. All three of these women positively identified Peter and his car. So the police went to his family house where he was living with his parents. His dad opened the door and he just goes off at the police. He's like, there's no way Peter would do something like this. He really did not want to let them talk to Peter because this is often how his parents were described as being. And this is why that psychiatrist said that his mum was overprotective, because in their eyes, he was just like this perfect little angel. He could do no wrong. They wouldn't hear of it. Peter was arrested and he was taken to trial for the rape of this young mother. And the forensic psychologist, Dr. Alan Bartholomew, told the court during trial, quote, "I'm reasonably certain that this youth has a serious psychosexual problem, that he's using the technique of denial as a coping device, and he is to be seen as potentially dangerous. The denial technique makes for huge difficulty in treatment." One of the detectives on the case also wrote to the Crown Solicitor that he is, quote, "a very dangerous person who will continue to offend where females are concerned and will possibly cause the death of one of his victims if he is not straightened out." And clearly they both had very good cause for concern here. In September of 1974, he was sentenced to 6 months for each of the three break-ins, like 3 separate 6-month sentences. And then he was also sentenced to 9 years for the rape, but he was able to serve all of the sentences concurrently. So a total sentence of 9 years with the possibility of parole after 5 years, which I have said it once and I will say it again. I don't get concurrent sentencing. Like if you're being sentenced to all of these different crimes, to all of these different sentences, you should have to serve them all. Like I just don't understand it, and I will never understand it. And also 5 years for rape is crazy, especially because I looked it up. The maximum time for rape in Australia is 25 years. And this guy has done it before. He's attempted to do it before. He'll do it again. It's one of those sentences that there is really a high rate of reoffending here. So 5 years is just, it's crazy to me. So he was 26 when he was released from prison in 1979, and he moved back in with his parents, who were now living in Frankston, which is about 54 kilometers or 34 miles southeast of Melbourne CBD. Within 2 months of his release, he attacked 4 other women over a 10-day period. On the 9th of November at 11:30 p.m., he raped a woman in a public toilet block in Frankston. He wore a balaclava, he had a knife, and he told the woman that if she didn't do as he said, he would stab and kill her. At one point during the attack, other people entered the bathroom and he put the knife to her throat to prevent her from talking. When Peter later read this victim's statement, he wrote a little note at the bottom of it that said, "I've read this statement and I'm sorry it happened, it's all true." 2 nights later, a woman was walking down the street when a man wearing a balaclava started chasing her. She ran out into the middle of the street and started screaming, and this man started gesturing for her to be quiet. When she wouldn't be quiet, he ended up running away, and this woman later identified Peter's balaclava. Peter also later admitted to being in the area with a balaclava and the intent to rape. At 9:15 p.m. on the 18th of November, an elderly woman was walking down the Nepean Highway in Frankston when she was grabbed from behind and forced to the ground by a man wearing a balaclava. This man told her that if she screamed, he would kill her. He then attempted to remove her cardigan, at which point she started screaming. The man then stabbed her in the chest, a wound which would require 14 stitches, and then the man fled. The next night, a woman was walking along Dandenong East Road when Peter, wearing a balaclava, jumped out from a vacant plot of land. The woman started screaming and Peter immediately ran away. He was arrested shortly after this, and he told the police, quote, "I waited in the bushes and the lady came along. I saw her coming and I put on my mask and jumped out at her. I wanted to rape her." He also told them that during the first attack, he wore a balaclava when he entered those toilet blocks, quote, "because I was going to find a woman to rape." He said in another interview, quote, "I've had a problem for about 6 years. I'm glad I got caught. It all started again about 2 weeks ago. I don't know if it was because my girlfriend left me or what it is. I just find it hard to mix with people and I haven't had many friends." By mid-1980, he was convicted of rape, malicious wounding, assault with intent to rob, and indecent assault, and he was sentenced to just 6.5 years with a minimum sentence of 5 years. And everybody who worked on this case, aside from the judge, who sentenced him to this, I guess, was totally shocked because everybody on this case knew it wasn't a question of if he was going to reoffend, it was a question of when he was going to reoffend. Like, this was clearly a dangerous man. And this is what I was saying at the start of the video, that this is a frustrating case, because in what world is 5 years a reasonable sentence for a man who has just attacked 4 women 2 months after being released from prison from raping a woman and attempting to rape 2 other women? And like, this is a man who has been committing crimes since he was 15 years old. There's no chance that this guy can be reformed, that he can be rehabilitated. All the psychiatrists now are saying, you know, it's going to be very, very hard to rehabilitate him if it's possible. So, I mean, really, it was just 5 years is insane. It's insane. I don't know what the judge on this case was thinking. So he was released again on the 27th of February in 1985, age 31. And on the 3rd of March, 1985, so 4 days after his release, he attacked another woman. This attack took place in Blairgowrie Beach, which is another 50 kilometers south of Frankston. A 21-year-old woman, you know, she just wanted to go to the beach, enjoy a nice day at the beach. She put her stuff down and she went for a walk along the water, and there's like some rocks, I guess, along the water. And she passed Peter Dupas and made a comment to him like, oh, you know, be careful, the rocks are sharp. He didn't say anything. She ends up going back to where all of her stuff is, and he follows her over there, makes a few mumbling comments, at which point she gets up, she tries to walk away, and he grabbed her. He forced her down onto her stomach, held a knife to her throat, and said, if you make any noise, then I will kill you. And he proceeded to rape her. After the attack, he then offered her a lift, asked her if she wanted a lift home, which of course she didn't, and he fled the scene. After he left, this woman saw 2 men walking nearby, and she went up to them to report what had happened. One of the men took her to her car to look after her, while the other man ran after Peter, but he just, you know, Peter had too much of a head start. He couldn't catch up to him. The man who had taken her to her car, he was driving along the road himself after all of this. And that is when he actually caught up to Peter in his car. He saw him while he was driving, got out of the car and grabbed him, handed him over to police. On the 28th of June, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison with a minimum sentence of 10 years. And the judge on this case said, quote, on the evidence which I have read before me this morning, there seems to be a very good chance, if you were at large again, that some other girl might suffer in the same way. Now the question is, what can I do? I've got that dreadful example of what did happen in front of me. There's a strong probability of your reoffending, that the recidivism rate in cases of your type is between 80 and 90% or even higher. For this reason, the judge suggested that when he is released, he be put on this treatment called Depo-Provera. It's a medicine basically that is supposed to reduce offending related to sexual fantasies by up to 70 to 80% apparently. During this time in prison, Peter attempted to take his own life twice, and it was also during this prison stint that he met a woman named Grace McConnell. And she was 16 years older than him. She worked as a nurse at the hospital. She had 4 children and she was divorced, and she described Peter as the model prisoner. She said he never caused any problems. They really started to bond, and she felt bad for him. She started to see herself as a mother figure to him. And, you know, she felt bad for him because she felt like he was really depressed in prison, and she thought that she could help him, that she could help rehabilitate him, you know, help him to become a normal person, a functioning member of society. They would just talk all the time about everyday things, about life, about feelings, about dreams. The more they spoke, the more Peter became infatuated with her, and eventually he ended up confessing his love for her and proposing to her, and she accepted. So they got married in 1987 in Castlemaine Prison. Grace explained that, you know, she felt this obligation to kind of see it out for his time in prison, and that hopefully by the time he was released, he would be a normal person, which of course he, you know, was anything but. During their time together, he ended up requesting to move prisons away from her, and she believes that he did this in an attempt to isolate her, to get her to move out there, away from all of her friends and family, which of course she did. She moved out there for him. Peter became very, very possessive. He told her that, you know, she needed to write to him every single day, and she couldn't just write to him on normal paper. She needed to write to him on pretty paper, because other wives of other prisoners in there got letters on pretty paper. During one of her visits, she brought a friend's 3-year-old son, which I thought was really interesting. I read a book about this case actually, and yeah, they said she brought a friend's 3-year-old son, which I don't know why someone would say, yeah, you can take my 3-year-old kid to prison to go and see a serial rapist that you're now married to. But she did. And at one point, the 3-year-old is sitting on her knee and Peter gets really pissed off at her because he needs her undivided attention. There can't even be a child sitting on her lap. Grace later described Peter as, quote, Dupas was a possessive, quietly domineering man. He was immensely jealous of all my friends and anything that I did that did not include him as the focus. In 1990, Peter's time for parole was nearing, and psychiatric reports at the time indicated he was still a risk to society and would still take a considerable amount of time until he was ready for release. But Peter, of course, felt he was ready. He told the parole officers that he had been attending different programs to prepare him for release, and also claimed that being married had given him responsibilities he had never experienced. So in March 1992, after serving just 7 years, 39-year-old Peter Dupas was released from prison. He and Grace moved in together and lived in a place called Woodend, which is about 70 kilometers north of Melbourne. They consummated the marriage once he was out of prison. Peter didn't want to do it while he was in prison because he felt like it was a private thing that should be done in his own home. So once he was out, they started having sex. Grace described their sex life as very basic. She said that she would, quote, go through with it as a sense of responsibility until eventually she reached the stage where she just couldn't even bear to have him touch her. She did say, however, that during their time together, she never saw Peter have any sort of sexual fantasies. She never saw him with any crazy desires. She never saw him with porn or anything like that either. Because of his criminal history, he wasn't able to get a job that would earn him any kind of money. So they lived off Grace's income. She was working as a cleaner at this time. And after about 20 months of living together, 20 months after his release, Grace believed that Peter was reformed. In September of 1993, a girl was riding her horse down Kineton Lane when a man stopped her in his car and told her that her horse was bleeding. So she got off the horse to check out what was going on, and he said to her, well, now you're off your horse and I'm out of my car, we can have a good time. Immediately, the girl gets back on her horse and tries to leave, but the man follows her, at which point she calls him a dirty bastard and the man left. And when she went and described this man to police, it was the description of Peter Dupas. In January of 1994, Grace had to work overnight at the nursing home she was working at, and Peter just became inconsolable and he insisted that he go to her work with her. When they got home, he then went and packed this bag and packed his car with all of the stuff he needed to go fishing the next day. But in this bag, he packed things like a balaclava, a knife, masking tape, condoms, a plastic sheet, a shovel. The next morning on the 3rd of January, he, with all of these items in his car, he headed out not to go fishing, but to a caravan park in Lake Epilogue. Wearing a balaclava and holding a knife, he entered a public toilet block and forced his way into a cubicle with a young woman. This woman later told police, quote, as I was sitting on the toilet, the door pushed open and I tried to push the door shut and said no. The next thing that happened was that I saw a hand and a knife come around the door, then a body, and I immediately stood up and tried to push the knife away from me with my left hand and received cuts to my middle and ring fingers and the palm of my left hand. At this stage, the male person was standing inside the door of the cubicle. When I tried to push the knife away from me, I felt my hand become wet. He then tried to turn me around and was repeatedly saying, just turn around. My bathers and shorts at this stage were still around my ankles. She went on to say that she kept telling the man how frightened she was. She kept asking him what was going on, and eventually he forces her out of the cubicle and miraculously he lets her go and he flees himself. So she runs out to all of her friends. She tells her fiance, who just happens to be an off-duty police officer, and they attempt to chase after Peter on foot, but Peter gets into his car. He's driving a blue Ford station wagon and he drives off. So they run back to their car and they get into a high-speed chase with him, and thankfully Peter ends up spinning out. So they catch up to him, They go over to his car, open the door, force him out of the car, and force him onto the bonnet of his car with his hands behind his back. And they kept him there with his hands behind his back until the police arrived. He was taken to trial for this attack, and the girl that he had stopped on her horse actually attended this trial, and she was able to identify Peter and identify his blue Ford station wagon. For the attack in Lake Epilogue, he avoided a rape charge due to a lack of evidence, but he was convicted of false imprisonment. For this conviction, on the 21st of November in 1994, he was sentenced to 3 years and 9 months with a minimum term of 2 years. The sentencing judge called his previous convictions and his criminal history breathtaking, and said that he was clearly a serious sexual offender and that this was clearly a sexually motivated crime. But because he wasn't being convicted of a crime of a sexual nature, he couldn't take that into account in his sentencing. He also said the fact that the attack was short and that he voluntarily let her go was an important consideration in his sentencing. The woman that he attacked told journalists that because of this attack, she felt scared even walking down the hallway in her own home. She felt scared going to the toilet at night because of Peter and because of what had happened. Grace was completely shocked to hear about all of this. She thought that he had been out fishing. So once she found out about this crime, she divorced him. And she said that when they were together, he was a self-obsessed, needy, lazy slob. She also said, quote, "He insisted that he was in love with me and that he could come out of himself and become a normal person. I agreed, not out of particular love for this man, but from a sense of responsibility to helping him become a useful member of the community. In my mind, our relationship was mother and son," which is kind of a weird thing to say about someone that you were having sex with, but I don't know, Grace. I don't know, babe. I don't think we can justify that one. Anyway, so in September of 1996, at age 43, Peter was once again released from prison after serving just 2 years. He moved into a flat in Brunswick, which is an inner northern suburb of Melbourne, and shortly after moving there, he met a woman who lived on the same street as him. They moved in together in May of 1997 into a flat in Pascoe Vale. He got a job working at a furniture factory, but after complaining of some sort of injury to the wrist, he started making furniture from his own garage. The next year in September, so September 1997, his girlfriend goes on an overseas trip and he just becomes completely unhinged. He starts obsessively calling sex workers, phone sex lines, massage parlors. And then of course, on the 4th of October 1997, his killing spree begins with the murder of 40-year-old Margaret Mah. So when 28-year-old Nicole Patterson was murdered in April of 1999, and police found that her first client happened to be this serial rapist, Peter Dupas, who had used the fake name Malcolm and a fake phone number, they were certain that he was their guy. They knew that he had obtained Harry's number through a job ad and that that number was found in Nicole's diary dated the day that she had died. They knew that he had personally called Nicole's landline multiple times as early as 6 weeks before her murder. So he had been planning this for a long time, and he had called her in excess of 16 times trying to ascertain when she was home, if she was home alone, that sort of thing. On the 22nd of April in 1999, the police tracked him down to the Excelsior Hotel in Thomastown, and he was arrested that day, taken down to the station for questioning. One of the first things they noticed when they took him in for questioning was that he had 2 scratches on his left cheek, and he claimed that this was a result of doing some woodworking in his shed. He said a piece of wood from his lathe hit him in the face, but searches of his home found that he didn't even have a lathe. He denied knowing Nicole. He denied having anything to do with her murder because, you know, he couldn't have done it if he didn't know who she was. He later admitted that he actually did give her a fake name and a fake number because he wanted to do a session with her to, you know, try and work out his sexual issues, but that he later cancelled the session. He told her that he was going to work through it on his own.
Nikki was professional. She would never have the dog in the house, of course, when she was seeing a client. He used the false name and he used the false number. Those details were in a diary of Nikki's, and Dupas, even though he did go through the house, he missed them. So he did his best to disguise the crime, but not enough.
So while he's at the station being questioned for police, there's obviously a whole team out searching his apartment. And in his wheelie bins, they found 13 pieces of newspaper which had writing on them. One of these pieces of newspaper read Nikki 9 Mo. And of course, Nikki was Nicole Patterson's nickname. He had a meeting with her at 9 a.m. in the morning, so they assumed Mo meant morning. Another scrap of newspaper had her address written on it. On some of the other scraps, he had written the name Malcolm, he'd written the name Harry, and he'd also written part of a phone number. When these scraps of newspaper were analysed and the handwriting was analysed, they were able to confidently say that this was Peter Dupas's handwriting. At his house, they also found a copy of the Herald Sun from the 21st of April, and on the front page was a photo of Nicole, and Peter had obviously ripped a tear through her face. Also at his house, they found yellow PVC tape, which matched PVC tape that was found at the scene of the crime. They also found a bloodstained green jacket, which had a black balaclava in the pocket. They found CCTV footage from a petrol station from the day of Nicole's murder in which Peter was wearing this jacket. And when the jacket was tested, it came back that the blood belonged to both Nicole and Peter. So at his trial for the murder of Nicole Patterson, he pled not guilty. And his defense, get this, his defense tried to argue that it was all one big setup, that the police had planted all of the evidence against him, which thankfully didn't work. And on the 22nd of August 2000, after 3 hours of deliberation, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing judge, Frank Vincent, said, quote, "The prospects of your eventual rehabilitation must be regarded as so close to hopeless that they can be effectively discounted. There is no indication whatsoever that you have experienced any sense of remorse for what you have done, and I doubt that you are capable of any such human response. At a fundamental level, as human beings, you present for us the awful, threatening, and unanswerable question, how did you come to be as you are?" During victim impact statements from Nicole's family, the diary of Nicole's 8-year-old niece was handed to the judge, and there was a page there where she had written, quote, "I used to be happy, but now I'm sad because Nikki's dead. She's in heaven with God and you can't see her anymore." Her mother, Nicole's sister, said that she had written in her diary many times about how much she missed her auntie Nicole, and she had more than 50 photos of them in the diary. She wrote a story about Nicole called My Favorite Person, which she wrote 6 months after Nicole's murder, and at the end of it, she drew a picture of a broken heart. The loss of Nicole was devastating for everybody that knew her, and especially her family. And at her funeral, her dog Bella started barking every time her name was mentioned.
Bella was her baby, and I recall, whenever I was over there.
Peter did attempt to appeal his conviction in 2001, but thankfully this appeal was dismissed. He was also the only suspect that hadn't been ruled out in the murder of 25-year-old Messina Vargas, so police really now started to narrow in on him for this, as well as the murder of 40-year-old Margaret Mah. Out of the 1,378 female homicides between 1989 and 2000, the only 2 cases of breast mutilation like that, where their breast had been cut off from their body, were in the cases of Margaret Mah and Nicole Patterson, which police did not find to be a coincidence. So police looked into Peter's home phone records and found the string of calls that he had made in September of 1997 after his girlfriend went overseas, and they were actually able to get in contact with some of the phone sex workers that he had called. One of these women said that while she was working for a phone sex company around this time, that she received a call that was deeply, deeply disturbing. The man was really scary, and he started talking to her about his mum, calling his mum a bitch, and then when she told him that she was 45, he hung up and said that he wanted to talk to somebody who was over 50. So he ends up calling back, and she tells him this time that she is 55 years old. And there are some quotes from an interview this woman did about this call in the book that I read about this case. I don't remember the title off the top of my head, but I'll write the name of the book in the description down below in case you guys are interested in reading that. But this worker says that he said to her, "Do you know what I did to the bitch?" And when she asked who, he says, "My mother, the bitch." The woman added, quote, "It was scary. He said something about his hand pressing on her neck. He also said that he cut down and across the breast. He said he cut across the nipple. At this stage, his voice changed and his breathing was different. He liked the blood. You could tell he liked it. When he spoke about the blood, he breathed differently and sounded excited, like he was aroused." So at the end of the call, he ends up saying, "How does that make you feel?" At which point she hangs up on him. He calls her back again and says, "Don't hang up. I know who you are and I know where you live." She said, quote, quote, he said something about her eyes. I don't remember his exact words, but he said something about looking at her eyes. Then he said something about putting the steel down her stomach and he grabbed her hair. When he said he cut her hair, he had an angry, hateful tone in his voice. He was talking about pubic hair. She also said that any time that she tried to speak, he would get really angry and his voice would get deeper. She also said that when he started talking about blood, specifically blood coming from a nipple, she could tell that he was masturbating to that. She said that he said, quote, fuck her with the blade. He made some comments about the shape of her vagina, but he referred to it as a pussy. She said that she ended the phone call by calling him a sick prick, and then she tried to hang up the receiver, but I guess it didn't go down properly because she could still hear him, and she heard him call her an old cunt, at which point she was just so terrified. She just never wanted to hear this guy's voice again, and she actually pulled the whole plug for the phone out of the wall. Police also tracked a call that he had made to a tarot card reader who had advertised in the local newspaper. They spoke to her and she said that when he called her, he was talking to her about issues that he was having with female relationships and sexual desires. And it was to the point, like it was creeping her out to the point that she was like, look, I really think that you should seek some professional help. And he told her that he had and it wasn't working. And he just started asking to meet with her and said, can I be alone with you? I want to meet with you alone. And she just kept telling him, no, I'm not going to meet with you. No, I don't want to see you, because she was just getting very weird, scary, creepy vibes from him. But that whole phone call with the tarot reader was very reminiscent of what happened with Nicole Patterson, in that he found the advertisement in the newspaper, called her up and tried to make a meeting with her. But in this case, he wasn't able to meet with the tarot reader. So on the 6th of August, 2001, police end up bringing him in for questioning in relation to the murder of Margaret Mah. And he denies knowing her. He denies having any involvement in her murder whatsoever, but he does provide DNA samples to the police, which they go and test against the black woolen glove that was found near her body when her body was found at Clifford's Road. And lo and behold, his DNA was found on that glove. Now, despite having all of the evidence they believed they needed to convict him of the murder of Margaret Mah, they had to wait until the coroner's inquest into her death was complete before they could actually arrest him and charge him with the murder. So it wasn't until October of 2002 that Peter Dupas was charged with the murder of Margaret Mah. His trial began on the 26th of July 2004. A total of 51 witnesses gave evidence against him. And just 16 days later, on the 11th of August, he was sentenced to imprisonment for the rest of his natural life without the possibility of parole. Margaret's brother thanked the police for bringing his sister to justice, and he said, quote, Margaret lived her life in the way that she chose, and no one had the right to take that life from her. Some of Nicole Patterson's family also attended the trial in support, and Nicole's mum, Pam, said, quote, every conviction we can get against him is important to us. I know he's supposed to be in jail for the rest of his life, but I just don't trust the system. And I mean, why would she trust the system when he was released time and time again, allowed to commit more and more crimes and escalate in those crimes until eventually he murdered multiple women? That's also exactly why Pam spoke to reporters and called for mandatory minimum sentences for repeat sex offenders, because serial rapists like Peter Dupas should never have been free to kill. The presiding judge on the Margaret Mah case said, quote, your offending is connected with a need by you to vindicate a perverted and sadistic hatred of women and a contempt for them and their right to life. You intentionally killed a harmless, defenseless woman who, like all your other victims, had no prospect of protecting herself from you. Based on your repeated violent offenses and on the gravity of this offense, there is no prospect for your rehabilitation. Nothing was advanced on your behalf that there is even the faintest glimmer of hope for you. Messina held Vargas's father, George, also attended every single day of the trial as well, knowing that he was suspected of killing his daughter too. He told reporters that he was happy with the verdict and happy that Margaret got her justice, and so too would Messina, because police were, they were really closing in on him for her murder as well. He was the one suspect that had never been ruled out. He'd been a suspect all along. They just never had the evidence to convict him because he left no forensic evidence at the scene of Messina's murder. They had actually interviewed him twice early on in the investigation. And during those interviews, he had a facial injury, which he explained away to police in the same way that he tried to explain away the scar on his cheek that was found when he was questioned for Nicole Patterson's murder. He also sold a car to one of his co-workers shortly after Messina's murder. And by the time police, looked into him and suspected him, that car had already been scrapped. So they were never able to examine it, which is a massive shame because there could have been, and probably was, was a lot of evidence in that car. It's theorized that after the murder, he ran straight to his car because the car park was only 40 meters away from where Messina's body was found. And because of all the blood found at the scene, it was very likely that the murderer, Peter, would have been completely covered in blood afterwards. So he probably traipsed that blood all throughout that car. And that's probably why he sold it so soon after the murder. Also, right after the murder, he went to the hair salon to cut and color his hair. And they also found that his grandfather's grave was located less than 128 meters or 140 feet from Messina's grandmother's grave. Police went and they re-interviewed all of the witnesses that had heard the screams at the cemetery on the day of Messina's murder. They also went and re-interviewed those 9 women who had seen this creepy man at the cemetery in the months leading up to the murder and on the day of the murder, and all 9 of those witnesses positively identified Peter Dupas as the man that they had seen there. And then their major breakthrough came in the form of a prison informant who had been incarcerated with Peter. This informant was a man named Andrew Fraser. He was a former high-profile solicitor that had been convicted of possessing, using, and trafficking drugs, and he and Peter had become friends in prison. Despite them being friends though, he described Peter as, quote, probably the most dangerous person I've ever met. He said he was, quote, very quiet, suspicious, introverted, or introspective, socially inept. The first indication that he got of Peter's involvement in the murder was when they were out in like the recreational area of the prison. Another inmate from another section of the prison comes up and starts berating Peter, claiming that he is Messina Helvargas's cousin and saying that he knew that he had killed her and that he would kill him if he got the chance. After the altercation, Peter turned to Andrew and said, "How does that know I did it?" He also mentioned on at least 2 separate occasions that he left no evidence whatsoever at Faulkner Cemetery and that nobody could have seen it because nobody was there. And the only way that he could have known this is if he was the killer. There were suggestions that Andrew had actually come forward for the $1 million reward, but police argued that he didn't come to them, they came to him, and that this was more than 6 months after the reward was offered that they spoke to him. He also wasn't given the full $1 million of this reward. Finally, on the 11th of September 2006, Peter Dupas was formally charged with the murder of Messina Helvargas, to which he pled not guilty. And on the 9th of August 2007, he was handed his 3rd life sentence without the possibility of parole. He did appeal this as early as September of that same year, but this was rejected. However, in October of 2007, his lawyers requested a retrial due to the publicity of the case, and this was granted. However, on the 19th of November, his initial conviction for the murder was upheld. After his second conviction, Messina's brother Nick made a victim impact statement in which he said, quote, "She's never far from my thoughts. Messina is now my angel. Throughout all these court cases, I've seen that you are scared, afraid, and alone. You cannot even speak to defend yourself, and when you're asked to talk, you whisper like the coward you are. Now it is time for you to go away and never be heard from again, and then rot in hell. My biggest regret is that I could not protect Messina from being hurt by an inferior being like you." But that's not the end of this case. There are several more murders that Peter has not been convicted of, but is believed to have committed. Andrew Fraser said that Peter had mentioned an old Sheila down the road from him in Pascoe Vale, which Andrew believed he was speaking about the murder of 95-year-old Kathleen Downs, who was stabbed to death in a Brunswick nursing home on the 31st of December in 1997. She had been found with 3 stab wounds to the throat and 1 slash to the throat, and this came just 1 month after the murder of Messina Helvargas. An investigation showed that Peter had actually contacted the nursing home prior to the murder, and so in February of 2018, he was formally charged with the murder, but the trial didn't end up going ahead. It had to be dropped because their star witness, Andrew Fraser, by this point was deemed too sick to testify. Police did note that they want to pick the case back up, and in December of 2000, a $100,000 reward was posted for any information that would lead to a conviction, but unfortunately there haven't been any updates on this. On the 13th of February in 1985, 47-year-old Helen McMahon was found beaten to death on Rye Beach. Her body was found completely naked and covered with a blood-soaked beach towel. This method of murder wasn't like any of Peter Dupas's prior crimes, but he had attacked another 21-year-old woman in nearby Blairgowrie Beach on the 3rd of March. And if you remember, it was thought that he was released from prison on the 27th of February, so 2 weeks after Helen's murder. However, it was discovered that he was actually on a pre-release at the time. Finally, Peter is also thought to be responsible for the murder of 31-year-old Renita Brunton on the 5th of November in 1993. She had gotten married just 6 months before before her murder, and she was stabbed 106 times in the kitchen of a clothing store which she owned in Sunbury. A friend of Renita's later told police that she'd been doing some private counselling at the back of her shop and that she had been talking with a previously violent sexual offender. At the time of the murder, Peter had been living in Woodend, which is less than an hour's drive from Sunbury, and the murder also fits his MO. He was able to provide an alibi for this murder, but he's always remained a suspect in the case, and the case still remains unsolved.
I would plead to the person perhaps who has done this to think about what they've done. And you need help.
But that's everything. That's everything for this case. I know it's a big case. That's why it's so dark now in my video, because I have been filming for 4 hours and 53 minutes. It takes me a really, really long time to film these videos. And we only have about 5 hours of sunlight in London at the moment. So I need to figure something out. I got to get some lights or something because it is dark. But yeah, that is everything for this case. It is a really, devastating case. The loss of life in these women, everything that their families and their friends had to endure going through this, knowing what happened to their loved one. And not just that, but the women who will be traumatized for the rest of their life because of the other attacks that they survived. And honestly, it's really, really frustrating because, I told you this case was super frustrating because he really should have been in prison for a lot longer for a lot of his prior crimes. He really shouldn't have been out on the streets and able to commit these murders. It was very clear that he was just escalating. It was very clear that there was no world in which he could be reformed or rehabilitated. So it's a really frustrating, it's a really disappointing case, actually. It's really disappointing that this was able to happen, that there wasn't more in place to prevent something like this from happening. This guy is, really, he's a piece of shit. He is the scum of the earth, and it's devastating. It's devastating, really. And that's why these cases are so important to talk about as well, because it's important to talk about these things and show that, things do need to change. There are things that really need to change to protect women in these situations. But yeah, that's everything for this case. That's all from me today. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. I hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and hopefully I will see you in my next video. Bye guys.